Good evening. Good evening. And welcome to this podcast of this episode of Kingdom Lifestyle Moments. My name is Joseph Floyd. I'm the host, and you've just stepped into a wonderful world where we can encounter God and become kingdom-minded people, prepared for the return of the King. And tonight, I want to discuss with you one area that is of particular interest to me is rejection, because I lived in a life where I felt insecure and rejected. But yet I found favor. I found favor with God, and I found that I had favor on my life, even though I grew up and let insecurity, fear, jealousy, rejection follow me into my adult life and kept me really from fulfilling my call of what I was called to do. No one is exempt from rejection. Everybody experiences rejection at some point. They may not admit it. Poor people, rich people, everyone gets rejected. Governments get rejected. Businesses get rejected. Even in the Bible, nations got rejected. Nations get rejected by other nations today. Israel got rejected. And look at our world today. There's just, everywhere we turn, there's some kind of rejection going on. What does the word rejection mean? Merriam-Webster defines it as the act of rejecting. To reject means to refuse to accept, consider, or submit to some purpose or use. Wow. But I like the biblical definition. If you take the Hebrew word, it means to spurn, cast off, disregard. It means to discard. And that's how a lot of people feel. Maybe you feel like that right now. Maybe you feel like someone that's been thrown into the trash heaps of society. You're no good. You don't count. Maybe you grew up like me and you couldn't identify with who you really were created to be. You grew up in the church. Maybe your parents were leaders like mine. I often identified as the preacher's son. I thought that was cool, but then when I got to school and people laughed at me and picked on me, it wasn't funny, so I said, oh no, I don't want to identify with that. I wanted to be cool. I wanted to hang out with the guys, the fellas, or, I didn't want... You see, it created problems. I walled off over here. I built walls over there. I became insecure. I had fear, jealousy, competition. Then there was a sibling. There was just all sorts of opportunities, and doors and wounds just kept piling on one after the other. And not to mention, I had these supernatural visitations as a child. I could hear God's voice. Even when God called me to minister, I had visions, but people around me said God didn't talk that way today. They didn't know what to do with me, and they still don't, but that's okay. I just obey God. But my point is, I was different. Like you, maybe you grew up in the church and you were different. You wanted to identify with how God created you. And I'm not talking about sin issues. I mean, I had enough of those. I chose a lot of those because of my rejection. And often that's what happens to us. But when we allow allow what people think of us to take shape and create our identity, we begin to separate. We put walls around us and we're isolated. And that's what the enemy wants to do. He wants to isolate us. He wants to keep us from walking in our full identity. He doesn't want anyone to be who they were called to be. And you see, the church has been good at hurting people. Still do it today. But it doesn't have to be that way. You see, there was a man in the book of 1 Samuel. He had a lot of problems. He had a high calling on his life. He had killed this giant, and then the guy whose job he was supposed to take, Saul, chased him. Gave him his daughter, but that didn't go so well. And he just had one problem after the other. And finally, his name was David. He partnered up with some of Israel's top-notch enemies and their leaders, the Philistines. He even went to a leader named Achish, and he said, hey, if I found favor in your sight, give me one of your cities. And he did. So David had favor in the Philistines' eyes, but not in his own people's. Wow. Have you ever felt like that? You had more favor, you more identified with the bad guys? Well, I've been down that road. But our story gets even more complicated. Later, Saul comes to fight the Philistines, and David is going to go fight his own people, or at least that's what he said. And he's got about 600 men in their families. But these bad guys, the Philistines, there were 5 leaders, and the other 4 they didn't want any part of it. So Achish sends David back to Ziklag. Remember that name, Ziklag. And when he gets there, the whole town's been burned. These Amalekites had taken the women, the children, and now all his men, they're ready to stone him. Things wasn't looking well for David. He had lost everything. He lost his army. He lost his family. He had his kingdom. He hadn't even, he was far from being the king, sitting on a throne. But what did David do? He did what I've had to do most of my life, and I finally come to a place that it's the only thing we can do. David strengthened himself in the Lord. 1 Samuel 30, verse 6. Go check me out. He strengthened himself in the Lord. And, of course, the story, the story, that he ended up on the throne and most revered king of Israel, and he's very much like Jesus. But he had favor with the Philistines. Everybody needs favor. We want favor with man. I mean, that's the second commandment, right? Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart. That's the first commandment. The second commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, but did he have favor in God's eyes? Well, over in 1 Samuel 18, verse 19, he records that God brought me to a broad place because he delighted in me. God delights in his people, and he's for us. And it took me a long time to understand that he really, really, really enjoyed me, and that I could be his favorite. And that's how I began to overcome rejection. Sure, I had to forgive those that rejected me. A lot of them didn't even know it. Maybe you've been bullied. Maybe you've been picked over in a job. Maybe you just grew up not feeling wanted by anyone. And you know what? Maybe you were like me. I didn't walk away from God at one point. I got in the car and drove away from God. How about that? I still was in the church doing things, but I really wasn't there. I had checked out. I drove away, but I came back because I found out he delighted in me. And so I want to leave you with that. Forgive those. That's what Jesus would tell us to do. Forgive those that have made you feel insecure, that has caused you to be jealous and competitive. and just come out of agreement with the spirit of rejection, and begin to identify with a chosen child, a favored child of the King, Jesus. Because you have favor, you have high favor from heaven. And I just want to leave you with that God really enjoys you, but not when you identify with rejection, and you have to be competitive and jealous and insecure. Trust Him. And so next time I'll be dealing with humility and serving as we delve into a kingdom lifestyle. And I would like to leave you with some resources. There's a couple of resources. Enjoying God by S.J. Hill. Dealing with the Root of Rejection by Joyce Meyer. God's Remedy for Rejection by Derek Prince. And Destroying Rejection by John Eckhart. These are just some resources that I think you would need to check out. But also, if you want to read this whole blog, go over to my website, writeitplain.com, and check out some other posts there. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.